Hello guys, and welcome back to the reaction zone. In today's lesson we're going to look at a galvanic cell. But before that, we're going to recall our previous knowledge on electrochemical cells. Electrochemical cells are devices that are either used to convert electrical energy into chemical energy or to convert chemical energy into electrical energy. There are two types of electrochemical cells. Electrolytic cells, in which electrical energy is converted into chemical energy. The second one is galvanic or voltaic cells, in which chemical energy is converted into electrical energy. Now, electrochemical cells usually have one type of chemical reaction that takes place in them, and that chemical reaction is redox reactions, that is, reduction oxidation reactions. So we're now going to focus on the galvanic cell, which is what this video is about. An example of a galvanic cell is the Daniell cell. Now, the Daniell cell is a galvanic cell that is used to generate electricity from spontaneous chemical reactions. Now, this spontaneous chemical reactions involves zinc and copper. Now, a Daniell cell has the following components. It has a zinc rod or a zinc metal that is dipped into a zinc sulfate solution. It has a copper rod or a copper metal, which is this, that is dipped into a copper sulfate solution. And then it has a Saltbridge, which is connecting the two solutions together, as well as a wire that is connecting the zinc rod to the copper rod. So these are the four major components in a Daniell cell. Now, the zinc rod dipped into a solution of zinc sulfate makes up a half cell. And also, the copper rod dipped into a solution of copper sulfate makes up another half cell. Now, when the zinc rod is connected to the copper rod through this wire, there are certain observations that will be made. And the observations are as follows. 1. Flow of electrons through the external circuit. Second observation is that the zinc rod loses its mass while the copper rod gains its mass. The third observation is that the concentration of zinc sulfate increases while the concentration of copper sulfate decreases. The fourth is that the solutions in both half cells remain electrically neutral. So, when the zinc rod or the zinc electrode is connected to the copper electrode or the copper rod, these are the observations that are made. Now, why would electrons flow from the zinc half cell to the copper half cell? This is what happens. When the zinc rod is connected to the copper rod through this wire, what happens is that the atoms of zinc on the zinc rod will lose electrons and ionize and go into the solution as zinc ions. So this shows the equation at the anode. zinc atoms losing electrons and entering the solution as zinc ions. Now, those electrons travel through the connecting wire and in the process generate electric current. Now, those electrons that are lost by zinc atoms that are ionizing and going into solution as zinc ions will be used to reduce copper 2 ions from the solution to copper. Now, let us not forget that the solution here is copper sulfate, which comprises copper 2 ions and sulfate ions. So, when zinc atoms lose electrons on the zinc rod and go into the solution as zinc ions, the electrons that they lose travel through the connecting wire, generating an electric current, and those electrons are accepted by copper 2 ions in solution to form copper atoms which will be deposited on the copper rod. So, the zinc rod loses its mass because zinc atoms are ionizing and going into the solution as zinc ions. And the equation for that is what we see here. The copper rod increases in mass because copper 2 ions from the solution are undergoing reduction by accepting electrons and are deposited as copper on the copper rod. So, the zinc rod decreases in mass, the copper rod increases in mass. Also, the concentration of zinc sulfate is going to increase. Why? Because let's not forget that zinc sulfate is made up of zinc ions and sulfate ions. So, as zinc atoms are undergoing oxidation by losing electrons and going into the solution as zinc ions, it means that the concentration of zinc ions in the solution is increasing. On the other hand, here, the concentration of CuSO4 is reducing because CuSO4 is made up of copper 2 ions and sulfate ions. And the copper 2 ions from the solution are accepting electrons to become copper atoms which are deposited on the copper rod, leading to a decrease in the concentration of Cu2 plus ions in the solution. Now, when zinc atoms lose electrons and go into the solution as zinc ions, the electrons move through the external circuit, through this connecting wire, and generate an electric current in the process. So we can see from this that indirect redox reactions has led to the production or the generation of electric current. And just like we said that in galvanic cells, that chemical energy is converted into electrical energy. So the redox reactions in the Daniell cell have led to the production or the generation of electric current. Now, one more thing to look at in the Daniell cell is the Saltbridge. The Saltbridge is actually an inverted U-tube. It has the shape of U. It's an inverted U-tube that is filled with concentrated potassium chloride or concentrated potassium nitrate. And it has several functions. One of the functions of the Saltbridge is that it connects the two half cells together. And by so doing, it completes the circuit of the Daniell cell. Another thing that it does is that it prevents the direct mixing of these two solutions. So it ensures that the solution in this half cell, which is zinc sulfate, does not mix with the solution in this half cell, which is copper sulfate. So it prevents direct mixing or mechanical mixing of the solutions. Now, it also maintains the electrical neutrality. It ensures that the solutions in these two half cells remain electrically neutral. Now, how exactly does this happen? Let us start with the zinc half cell. In the zinc half cell, we know already that zinc atoms will lose electrons and go into the solution as zinc ions. That will obviously bring about a situation where the concentration of zinc ions in this solution will be greater than the concentration of sulfate ions, because let us not forget that zinc sulfate is made of zinc ions and sulfate ions. Now, as the concentration of zinc ions increases, the solution tends to be more positively charged. To ensure that that does not happen, the Saltbridge will release anions that will restore the balance and ensure that this solution does not become positively charged but remains electrically neutral. In the copper half cell, we know that in the solution here is copper sulfate, and it comprises copper 2 ions and sulfate ions. We also know that in this half cell, that the copper 2 ions accept electrons coming from the zinc half cell to form copper atoms, which are deposited on the copper rod. So as a result of that, there will be more sulfate ions in this solution than copper 2 ions, which tends to make the solution become negative. But that does not happen because the Saltbridge will release cations to balance the charges and ensure that the solution remains electrically neutral. So, the fourth observation here is that the solutions in both half cells remain electrically neutral. And what makes that possible is the Saltbridge. Having said that, the copper rod, which is here, is the cathode. It is the positive electrode, and it is where reduction takes place. The zinc rod, which is here, is the anode. It is the negative electrode, and it is where oxidation takes place. So, in a Daniell cell, oxidation takes place at the anode, and reduction takes place at the cathode. Also, in a Daniell cell, the anode is the negative electrode, and the cathode is the positive electrode. So, the summary of what happens in a Daniell cell is that the redox reactions that takes place in these half cells leads to the generation of electric current. Specifically, the loss of electrons by zinc atoms on the zinc rod when they go into solution as zinc ions leads to the transfer of electrons from the zinc half cell to the copper half cells, and in the process generates electric current. So this is how spontaneous redox reactions leads to the generation of electricity in the Daniell cell. So I want to believe that this explanation of the Daniell cell as an example of a galvanic cell is clear. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next lesson.